see, for many of us, the problem of us getting along with other people is our inability to get along with ourselves. Everything visible and physical is preceded by something invisible and spiritual. The consequences we are dealing with in our lives, in our homes, in our culture, we are dealing with them because there is a gap between where God is and where we are. He wants to know that you want him and not just want his stuff. See, a lot of folk go to church to get God's stuff, but who don't want the God who gives it. So if you're in distress, don't let that drive you away, draw you near. When you get close and want to live for him, want to please him, want to honor him, want to exalt him, want to draw near to him, then heaven opens up and he lets you find him. He lets you find him. Kingdom authority may be defined as the divinely delegated right and responsibility for believers to act on God's behalf in spiritually ruling over his creation under the lordship of Jesus Christ. Kingdom authority is the divinely delegated right and responsibility that has been bequeathed to believers to act on God's behalf to rule over his creation under the lordship of Jesus Christ. With God's kingdom comes authority. One of the ways that authority is grasped, connected with, and utilized is in kingdom prayer. Kingdom prayer is divinely authorized access for heaven to invade earth, for heavenly intervention into historical circumstances. And one of the expressions that talks about authority is binding and loosing. Now, if you've grown up in church, you've heard people talk about binding this and binding that. And what they're talking about is exercising authority. And that is precisely what the phrase means. But I want to take you deeper into the meaning of the phrase, the utilization and understanding of how to apply the phrase so that you and I get the benefit of the phrase and start binding and loosing like we're supposed to. The word binding and loosing is not a magic formula for you to get God to do what you want. Yet it is a powerful formula because of what's stated. Because verse 18 says, whatever you bind. And it goes on to say, and whatever you loose. First of all, whatever. This scope of this statement is staggering. In other words, he doesn't give an exception. He says, whatever you bind, whatever you loose. It says heaven is going to back it up, or to put it in contemporary words, God says, I got you. I got you. Please notice something in the phrase. You are the one doing the binding, not God. You are the one doing the loosing, not God. Whatever you bind and whatever you loose will have been done in heaven. So God will back up legitimate binding and legitimate loosing. To bind means to restrict. To bind means to lock. To bind means to restrain. To bind means to tie down. To bind means to hold something so that it cannot do what it wants to do. You are limiting its ability to function because you've tied it up. You've bound it. You've wrapped it up. You've put a knot on it. You've held it back. Conversely, loosing is to unlock or to release. It is to permit. It is to free something up. The first thing that leads up to his statement in chapter 16 about binding and loosing is the statement is specifically given to and given about the church. I will build my church. He comes with binding and loosing after that statement. Why? Because binding and loosing is a specific authority given to the church. It's very important. Binding and loosing, the exercise of authority, is specifically given to the church. I will build my church. Now, the reason why that's important is you need to remember something about the church that we often lose sight of, and some don't even know. Why you come to church for preaching and for singing and for fellowship, and all of those are very important things, there is another purpose of the church that's absolutely critical, and that is legislating from the spiritual realm. The job of the church is to legislate from up there to down here, to bring heaven into history. That is the job of the church. It is to spiritually legislate, not just sing, not just preach, but to bring the authority from eternity in history. So it is, the church represents another realm, although it's located on earth. It represents heaven, but it's located in history. And it has been given homeland authority to operate in history from eternity. Now, the reason I'm pointing this out is many Christians don't understand this. If you are disconnected from the church, you are disconnected from its legal authority in the spiritual realm. He says, and the gates of hell shall not overpower it. He says, so powerful is the church I'm building that hell can't stop it. He didn't say shall not overpower me, he said shall not overpower it, because he's referring to the church that is legislating from heaven. So when you see hell defeating the church, it's because we're not building Jesus' church, we're building our church using Jesus' name. He says the church that I am building that legislates from history, Greek word ekklesia, church, was a legal term for legislation, legislating in the spiritual to bring it into history. He says the gates of hell, gates is a legal term. In the Old Testament it says the elders met at the gate. That's like saying city council meeting, city hall, Congress, parliament. It was the place where legislation was made at the gates. So it's a legal term, because hell does not defeat you with power. Hell defeats you with legality. Hell operates on a legislature, okay? It operates legally. And if you do not understand that, it's not just power operating, it's power operating from an illegal position, but yet from a legal posture. So he says, the gates of hell shall not overpower it. Now he's talking about the church. Then he goes further. Now we come to verse 19. I will give you the keys to the kingdom. Well, kingdom is God's rule. And I'm going to give you keys. He says, I'm going to give you access to me to legislate from there back down to where you live. And I'm going to give you these keys. Now, the reason why there are multiple keys is because there are multiple gates. Well, now we come to the end of verse 19. Whatsoever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will have been already loosed in heaven. I got you. So what exactly are we binding and loosing? Well, let me tell you. Based on this passage, you're binding and loosing what's coming out of hell. Gates of hell. You're binding and loosing. So what's the difference between binding and loosing? Bind, when you've been binding something, you're tying it up. You're keeping it from mobility. You're keeping it from moving. To bind means something is coming after you that you want held back from you. You want it to be tied up. You don't want it to get through. You don't want it to be able to penetrate you. It's holding evil, Satan, hell off of you. Loosing is because he already got you. He's already all up in your grill. He's already controlling something. You're already addicted. You're already living in defeat. You're already relationally in discord. You're already miserable and you can't get out of it, and you need to be loosed from the hostage taking he's already taken you. Binding is keeping him off you or anything that is influenced by him, because the hell influences everything. It influences death. It influences bad relationships. It influences addictions. It influences hell can influence any area of your life. To bind it means to keep it from having a illegitimate dominant influence. To loose means it's already having an illegitimate dominant influence. I'm already in debt over my head and can't get out. I'm already in a bad situation, relationship. I'm already addicted to something or the other. And I'm already held hostage and nothing is working, but I need to be loosed.
I studied the Bible in college for 4 years. I studied the Bible for 4 years working on my master's degree, another 4 years working on my doctoral degree. And then I've been preaching all of these years, and I'm still learning new things from this awesome, inexhaustible book, the Word of God. That's why I'm so excited about the Tony Evans Study Bible and its accompanying work, the Tony Evans Bible Commentary. It will take all of this training and this teaching and make it available to you to understand, utilize, and apply God's most powerful word.
I need to be set free from it. He says to bind, to keep it off you because it's coming at you, or to loose because it's already got you and you want to get rid of it. He says you must do it. Whatever you bind, I got you. Whatever you loose, I got you. Heaven will back you up. Well, if the problem is the gates of hell, he says you must use the keys of heaven, and you must do it in concert with the church, because that's the entity that owns the keys. So you don't have a private key ring. You don't have your own keys. The church has the keys. You have to use those keys for your situation. So now that we have that framework, let's go back to chapter 18. He starts off again in verse 18, and he begins this process by talking about binding and loosing. But now he goes further, and he's going to explain how to get this thing working for you. So I'm assuming somebody in here needs to bind something or loose something. Again, I say to you, verse 19, if two of you agree on earth about anything that they ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. Oh. Now we get down to 2 or 3. Interesting. 2 or 3 witnesses is not a novel concept. It's all through the Bible. American civil government, to a large degree, borrowed from the Bible, and one of the things they borrowed was the principle of witnesses. In Deuteronomy 19, verse 15, it says, you cannot accuse somebody by the witness of one person. There must be 2 or 3 witnesses. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 6, You cannot bring an accusation or judgment by one person. There must be 2 or 3 witnesses. So 2 or 3 witnesses was used of confirming something legally, because it's used of trying civil cases. Jesus takes the principle of legality, 2 and 3 witnesses, and applies it now to binding and loosing. Why? Because we are seeking to do in the spiritual realm what the political realm was seeking to do in civil judgments. To do that, he says you need 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, this is not just 2 or 3 people out of nowhere, because in verse 17 he says, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So he hasn't left the church. He's still talking about the church, because that is the authorized legal entity from heaven to history. So let me explain something. When you connect with people, even if they're Christians, who are not connected to the embassy, they can't help you with binding and loosing. Because binding and loosing has only been delegated to the church, not just to you out here just binding stuff and I bind the devil and no. If you are disconnected from the embassy, that's why people don't just need to go to church for preaching. People don't need to go to church just for singing. He says 2 or 3 gathered. Okay? The word gathered is used of the church in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25. Don't forsake the gathering. It's talking about the church. He says when they are connected, and 2 or 3, now we got legal validity, because that's how the word 2 or 3 is used in Scripture. We've got legal authorization. So let's see how you can begin to bind and loose. Keep the devil off of you in whatever category he's on you, or get him off of you if he's already locked you down, and loose him and get him off of your back. No longer is he controlling whatever area of your life that he happens to be controlling right now. He says, if you come together, 2 or 3, that's a legal gathering because it's connected to the church. Anything, somebody say anything. That's like whatever, okay? Verse 18 says whatever, verse 19 says anything. Anything that they may ask. Oh, we just introduced prayer, ask. So now you are asking. You're asking heaven to intervene on your behalf in history for the binding and loosing as defined in chapter 16, which is the gates of hell. He says, ask anything that they may ask. Please notice something. The 2 must agree. Forget spiritual authority where there is disunity. So he says it must be by agreement. That is, you've got to be in the same, you're different people, but you've got to be on the same spiritual page. Okay? So he says that. And then he makes a staggering promise. It shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. So you must bind, you must bring God's perspective, the keys, you must talk to God, the prayer, you must be in agreement with God, and then you must be linked to the legal entity, the local church. And he says, and you've done it in my name. In my name. He said the Father's going to do it, but you got to do it in my name. Now, Matthew 28:18 says, Jesus says, all authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. Translation, I'm in charge now. I'm in charge up there in heaven, and I'm in charge down here on earth, and I'm the link between the two. So in order to get it from heaven down here to earth, Jesus is saying, you got to come through me. There's one mediator between God and man, and the Bible says that is the man, Christ Jesus. He will only give his authority when you're operating on his authority based on his keys, connected with his institution, done by agreement. And he says that you must do it in my name, but he says something else. And there am I in the midst. Whoa. See, a lot of us pray in Jesus' name while he is on the periphery. He cannot be on the periphery. He must be he must be the centerpiece of the decision. You want to know God's philosophy of history? It's Ephesians 1:10. Because Ephesians 1:10 says God has circulated all of history around the centrality of Jesus Christ. So, binding and loosing, getting the devil from tying you up or releasing you if you've been tied up, is tied to authority. Authority is tied to Christ. Christ is tied to his church. Binding and loosing is tied to that connectivity by agreement. And then there is the provision of divine authority where the Father responds when we do it in his name. See, a lot of us use Jesus' name and we'll even quote Jesus' word, but without authorization, because we're not subjected to Jesus' will or subjected to Jesus' authority or subjected to Jesus' okay. And so it becomes an unauthorized use. And when it is an unauthorized use, you can't bind and loose, which means you can't have authority. Okay? But you must do the binding and loosing. God's not going to do it for you. He's going to say, I got you when you're operating as he said. So the question now is, why the 2 or 3 in this context? Let me use a biblical illustration to try to make sense of this. In Exodus chapter 17, beginning around verse 8, Israel is in a battle. They're in a war. They're fighting. It's a life and death struggle. They're battling. Moses goes up to the top of the hill. And Moses takes the rod, the staff that God gave him. They turned it into the rod of God. And Moses held it up. The rod was Moses' symbol of authority. He opened the Red Sea with the rod. It was the symbol of heaven coming down to change something on earth when he held up the rod. As long as Moses held up the rod, it says Israel prevailed. But the moment Moses dropped the rod, it says the enemy prevailed. Oh, wait a minute now. Israel down in the valley doing the best they can, fighting as hard as they can, trying as hard as they can. But whether they were winning or losing wasn't determined by how hard they were trying. It was determined by what Moses was doing, upholding up the symbol of authority. A lot of us are trying hard to fix our mess, get out of debt, get out of addiction, solve this problem, heal this. It's not we trying. We're trying down here in this battle, but the problem is something's got to be solved up there to give you victory down here. The problem occurred, however, that it says Moses' arms got heavy. In other words, he got tired. Let me put it another way. He got sick and tired. He got tired. His arms got heavy, and his arms started to droop. And when his arms started to droop, it says the enemy began to prevail because the symbol of authority had been lost. So Moses got 2 other men to come and to hold up his arms because he was tired. And he was going to droop and quit and give up. But the 2 men held up his arms. They became 2 witnesses. And when they held up his arms, it says, and Israel prevailed over their enemies. Let me put it another way. What was happening on the ground would not ultimately be determined by what they were doing on the ground. Now, they still had to fight on the ground, but the power and the authority for the victory of the fight was not on the ground where they were fighting. The authority and victory and power would come from what was happening in the invisible realm that would determine whether they won or lost in the visible realm. If you're fighting for your marriage, if you're fighting for successful singlehood, if you're fighting for the debt, if you're fighting for the addiction, or whatever the situation happens to be, yes, Yes, you have a responsibility to do what you ought to do, but that's not where the authority lies. Whatever you bind, whatever you loose, it says, I will have already done it in heaven. So the answer is up there. So to put it another way, if you ignore the spiritual, if you ignore the keys, if you ignore the connection with the church, if you ignore the agreement, if you ignore those things, you will not get help from heaven while you're battling the warfare on earth. You will only get victory on earth because you have engaged the authority of heaven God's way. And when you and I do that, now we'll see some binding and loosing.
Binding and loosing has to do with authority. It is the exercise of God's authority through us in history. When God talks about binding and loosing, he's talking about acting on his behalf to bring things about in time and space that is according to his will. And with this authority, like in a football game when the ref throws out the yellow flag or blows the whistle, it can override satanic power, people power, problem power, economic power, whatever the powerful forces are that are coming at you, kingdom authority, binding and loosing, can override it. I'm sure you like I have, things in our lives that we need to override. God gives us the right, the privilege, and the expectation to bind and loose in his name.